Okay, guys, sorry I couldn't make it there today. I had a couple things I had to take care of. Scramble to Africa was pretty nuts, considering there was only three teams or three countries that were competing for the areas in Africa, and there were still some issues that you guys were running into. It's still incredible to see, because when you have all of Europe actually participating in the Scramble for Africa during this age of imperialism, it can get very tense. So, as far as debriefing goes, look at how you guys divided yourself up. In the beginning, initially, many of you were willing to work with the people that I assigned to you, but you felt more comfortable still kind of dividing yourself from 5 into 3 groups that you felt more comfortable with. Look at the subtle things that countries use to symbolize what their culture is and what their aims are and what that could mean to other people. So some of the animals you chose, or what was in your flag, or what was in the anthem, can be perceived as something that's weak or strong, depending on the attitudes that you exude. So some of you who spoke about tolerance and being great and nice to people, whereas some of you might have thought, hey, let me have this animal eat children. It sends a different message. So anyway, Charles Darwin, a man that we know with the theory of evolution, and then getting it in turn, looking at it from a different angle of survival of the fittest, allowing for this, and here's the answer, choice number 2, allowing for Europeans to develop this idea that taking over other places, even though they have a different culture and way of life, is justifiable, is okay, because the Europeans are naturally stronger, naturally superior, and they have this responsibility to go in and take over other places. So let's go to our notes. So the Scramble for Africa, we see involved, obviously, European countries, companies, and their even missionaries. And much of their goal was to explore, but mostly to conquer. And again, missionaries were some of the first to go out and look at these places. The Dark Continent, aka Africa, was called the Dark Continent because it was a mysterious place, and also that Europeans thought it was a backward place that needed fixing to move forward. And this shows you a little bit of the European ignorance, because there were many aspects of Africa that had become advanced as far as how they perceived and looked towards each other and the rest of the world. And the unfortunate part is that despite these African people, and again, Africa's a huge continent, so we're categorizing millions and millions of people as one, which they were not. They were completely diverse. You're saying that these people, even though they have a different language, different type of clothing, different form of government, that they're backwards. And that's just wrong. That's like us calling the Vikings uncivilized. They were civilized. Civilized means you have an organized government. You have a system in place. You have basic thoughts and religion, food, clothing. And the African people had all of those things. It was just that they were different from the Europeans. Now, what happens is one of the most famous men to write about Africa was Dr. David Livingstone. And he, the way he wrote, it allowed for ordinary Europeans to participate in these exciting events of distant lands in Africa. So, he went in and he did expose some of the horrors that were of the Arab slave trade. But eventually, this one guy, Stanley, he, years and years later, after Livingstone went, Stanley goes in and he's looking around, and he comes upon Livingstone existing amongst the tribe, who had been long out of touch with his homeland. Stanley finds him and he goes, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And it's funny because he had been away for so long in the interior that he hadn't been heard from in a long time. But Stanley knew of Livingstone, and this has been a famous quote that many people say. That's kind of funny. So from all of this imperialism towards the scramble for Africa, we're going to see, of course, some literature coming out reflecting upon it. And there's a man by the name of Rudyard Kipling who will write a poem called The White Man's Burden. And as you read it today, after you finish these notes, you're going to see that it does have a lot of inspiration behind it towards Europeans to go and send your best men to kind of take care of this half-devil, half-child African. So it shows you the arrogance of the European, it shows you the entitlement of the European, but it also shows you their views on these Africans who they feel are in need of help. So why Africa? So again, in yesterday's game, we saw that there was a lot of different resources that were available in Africa for the Europeans to kind of carve up and use exponentially in profits for themselves. And they felt like it was just sitting there for them to take. Since the Africans weren't using it, they could take it. And then, of course, they set up areas where they could extract these raw materials from the mainland of Africa by using the Africans themselves, and of course with some help from people that they send there from Europe. And of course, if you look at many of these natural resources, they are great in using towards the Industrial Revolution. So all the more reason to go into Africa and carve it up. So looking back at old imperialism, where claiming land consisted of you getting there first, France, taking that philosophy, wanted to make a sweet deal with Portugal, who is now not even considered a contender for a status as a powerful country. France tells them that they can concoct a document that says Portugal had an understanding with the people of the Mokoko tribe in Congo. But if they did this, France would have exclusive rights to this area. So, Portugal, naturally, to kind of get in the game of competitiveness, agrees to this with France, and they produce this fake treaty saying that they can claim the land of the Mokoko tribe as theirs, because back in the day with old imperialism, that's how you claimed land. And France is like, yeah, dude, Portugal, I totally remember you getting this document. The problem is, the other European countries don't buy it, and they call BS on it. Mostly because the treaty that the Portuguese kind of concoct doesn't even look old. You're saying that this thing is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years old, yet you're giving them a fresh piece of paper saying that it's an old treaty that the Mokoko tribe allowed you to take their land. So, because the Portuguese didn't even really put effort into the look of this treaty, and England is at its wit's end about this whole scramble thing, they almost go to war. Germany steps in and says, hold up, wait a minute. So Germany starts this conference called the Berlin Conference. And at the Berlin Conference, this was the attempt to prevent war, and it was successful. The unfortunate part was, as you see the date here is 1844, 1885, we're going to see World War in the next couple of decades. So although Otto von Bismarck was smart in stalling World War I, it still happens anyway. But for Germany, at least, they were able to build up a little bit more. They end up losing, but that's another story for another time. So this new imperialism that's represented by a complicated and frenzied competition between European nations to control as much of the world as possible, it's a scramble. And in a scramble, and in a rush, and in a complicated and frenzied competition, it can easily become a fight. So this Berlin Conference was like the slowing down to that conflict. So this was all in an avoidance of bloodshed. So this international conference was kind of a mature diplomatic way of dealing with this terrible thing of carving up Africa. So now all these delegates of the European nations, these diplomats, they are invited to this conference. But guess who's not invited at all? any Africans. None were there. So at the Berlin Conference, only the European powers were recognized. And there were a couple decisions that were made. First, they decided that they would create their own boundaries, which means most of the boundaries that were already in existence that were understood by the African tribes are no longer. They're going to be ignored. So the Europeans are going to create their own, and they're not even taking into mind the geography of Africa either. The only two countries that are left independent and free, which I talked to you about already, were Ethiopia and Liberia. One because it actually was able to fight off the Italians, but the other because they received help from the United States. So they decided they wouldn't fight, and in order to claim a colony, you had to have effective occupation. So it's no longer the whole concept during the age of exploration where whoever gets there first gets it. You have to actually effectively occupy it. So you have to set up hospitals, a system of government, schooling, places that can actually represent functioning and organization of government. Another thing was when they looked at Africa, they did take into account how they were going to efficiently and effectively trade and travel. And so the waterways of Africa were internationalized, which means you could potentially use a river even though it's not in your colony. And this, of course, helped them economically. Politically, though, there would still be some tension there. Now, these rivers aren't the most navigable, right? You have terrible, terrible waterfalls and, the cataracts, and, of course, the jungles are very dangerous. So this was yet again another issue. Okay, this isn't really in your notes. I kind of threw this in here. Cecil Rhodes, super famous. He's British. His main thing was he really, 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 really wanted to build a railroad for the British from the north to the south of Africa. The only problem was the French. The French wanted to build a railroad going from west to east of Africa. And I believe I explained this already as well. So this is the Fashoda incident. And this incident, unfortunately, did not favor the British at all. In the end, both countries couldn't afford to construct a railroad running that deep through Africa. And so both projects were unfinished, but the French ended up gaining from the deal. The quickest way I could tell you is basically Britain knew that France was going to try to get to Fashoda first and set up a government there. So France basically said, and bluffed it pretty much, oh, we're going to get to Fashoda first and mess up your railroad. So Britain's like, well, I'm going to do anything you want so that you don't do that. And France is like, okay, give us Morocco. Now, if you look at where Morocco's at, that's a pretty important location as far as accessibility for transportation. So the British still agree to it because they're really, really into this railroad, but it doesn't work out for them. And still to this day, Britain owns the northern part of Gibraltar, but the southern part is France's. So it's still a place of contention. The last thing, which I probably won't be able to talk to you too much about because I only have a minute left to this, but King Leopold, who's the king of the Congo at this point, will, on his own, privately try to go after Congo, and he's very successful. Belgium at the time in Europe is a neutral country. It's not as powerful as, Britain, France, Germany, places like that. So Leopold is kind of acting on his own, trying to create his own company through gaining resources privately from the Congo. He's successful, sets up a company, becomes a CEO, and then completely takes advantage of the people in the Congo. Leopold tells, and at the Berlin Conference, this came into conversation of whether he can have it or not, and they give it to him because he agrees to sell copper and rubber equally to all.